Jack, how are you? This is part two of our fascinating discussion. I was just saying off air that I woke up the morning after having talked to you, and I just had a plethora of questions, and I was thinking I should have asked this. I want to ask that. That's the kind of richness of the discussion. So let's pick up where we left off, Jack. I want to talk about men and women. And you were saying some really interesting things about women and the role of women. And it reminded me of something a wise Chinese woman said to me decades ago. She said, Liz, I was a young mum actually. And so that was like 30 years ago. She said, Liz, a woman is three legs of the table. The woman is three legs of the table. And what she was trying to say was the man can be very strong and have a lot to offer his family, but it's for the women, it's for the woman to be very attuned and very very connected with what's going on, and in a way to carry much of the minutiae, I think. But at the time, I railed against that, having been brought up in that era when, oh no, I'll leave family till I'm, in my 30s, and I'm going to be with someone where it's 50-50 all the way, and all this nonsense that we've been fed as part of a programming. And over the decades, I've really thought, what exactly was she trying to tell me? What do you think she was trying to tell me?
Well, I think she was definitely wise. So when we talk about women and men and dynamics between the sexes, obviously we can get into the psychological part of it, and we can get into the behavioral part of it, and then we can get into the cultural layer of it, which is different, like depending on where you're from and where you are, and so on and so forth. And there's incredible levels of sophistication to that. But as a general thing, right? Well, if we look at the male expression and the female expression of the human being, these are sort of like each an emanation of a primary, sort of like a feminine and masculine charges, right? And we have to. These things are strange in a sense where you would think that the most effective and the most fair and the most equal way of interpreting these two separate things is like two halves of a whole, right? It's like 50-50.
Yes. Yep.
But the dynamic is a little bit like, history and time and human psychology and so on and so forth has shown us that it's not that simple. And when let's say we talk about, we've on our the last time you and I spoke, we were talking about it within a more negative context, within the context of, let's say, the Western world, how sort of like these, intergender dynamics unfold, so on and so forth. There's a lot of confusion in this area. But as a primary thing, I think it's very important for both men and women to understand a very simple truth on a societal level. We can get into the mysticism of it like later on, but on a societal level, it's very important to know that the male populace, the male population that is unable to provide emotional shelter. So, like, keep in mind, I'm saying emotional shelter, not physical shelter, because a large portion of the Western world is able to provide physical shelter, But if a male population en masse is unable to provide emotional containment and emotional shelter for the feminine mind, the feminine mind will never reach its peak state of existence, because it will not feel secure and it will not feel protected and sheltered enough to give its benefits back to the general populace, right? So what does a male population do when they have this issue? Well, obviously, they start disempowering the female population, because the only way to sort of like keep that female from seeking that emotional shelter elsewhere is by, I don't know, like creating these elaborate rules and whatever, like shame culture, so on and so forth, to quote unquote keep them in line. Now, the problem with this is this completely deteriorates the relationship, like the archetypal relationship that a woman and man, as like two parts of one whole have. And I believe this is the process we're seeing now, especially in the Western world, but not only. I don't just want to talk negatively about the Western world. It just happened that we were talking about that specific thing. But in general, I feel like most people, most humans today, they're in this strange sense of solipsism where they can't empathize with the other. And it's not that they can't empathize with the other gender, they can't empathize with the other period, because they see no function and value in it. Because all we've been taught is, well, engage in the things that have value and bring you, well, something like a material return, right? So what value is there to being an empathetic human being, right? They don't see it. That's what I think.
That's fascinating. I mean, I know intuitively, and I know from the study that I've done, that there has been an absolute denuding of the family, of the meeting of the male and female energies. This has been worked on. This is part of Agenda 2030. They say it in Agenda 2030. They want the breakdown of family. They don't want strong men with very connected, nurturing women and beautifully connected children, because that family unit will fight for itself and will not allow invaders or communism or Marxism. Marxism likes the breakdown of family, because then the parents who are so broken hand over more willingly their children to the state. It's all about the upward movement of power and money and control. Whereas a strong family unit is taking back control and taking back its power into that unit, isn't it?
Well, it's a support circle. And obviously, like if I'm I don't know, like let's say a party without morals and just looking at the profit margin, what I want is the whole populace to become a workforce, and then I want the whole populace, including women and the men and where they can even get away with it, even children. I want that whole populace to sort of be subservient to my goals. Them being subservient to my goals means my influence increases and their influence decreases, and that also means that, well, what is a family to any person, right? It's an immediate support circle whose loyalty is more or less guaranteed. And the family is the primary predictor, right? When it comes to repeated behavior, repeated uh, um, the avoidance of repeated behavior that is self-harming, right? So if you have a strong family unit, right? Let's say you make a mistake, you need the backbone of the family, right, to sort of put you in your place a little bit, and also sort of like to ground you. So if you don't have that backbone, what happens to a person who's alone? They just like sort of like devastate their own psyche, because humans are not meant to be and live alone and deal with such an overwhelming amount of emotional input alone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So right now that input is overbearing, and then you create the system where the family unit isn't encouraged anymore, because it's not even financially beneficial, right? So then you get this strange society where everyone is just, yay, individualism and freedom and blah blah blah, but all of that is just a very cheap mask over loneliness and depression and emptiness, and feeling this void within you where you lack purpose, that sort of thing. And that's what we're looking at. So, like, let's say the dystopian sense, and if we're a little bit pessimistic about it, right, give it like 10, 15 more years, and that's sort of like the dynamic you're looking at between people, where everyone has a friend with benefits, but no one has an actual friend.
Gosh, and it's the same with families, really, where these parents feel such pressure to go outside, to work, to get more money, to get more things to provide for the children so they have a better material life. But this lovely little neighbor that I have, she lives so simply, almost a monastic existence. She needs very few things and is so appreciative if I take a meal into her. But she said to me once, I feel sad for what's happening now, Liz. I remember in the early days when women started going to work outside their families, And I would ask them, why are you leaving your children with someone else? Why are you missing those years with your children? And the mothers would go, oh, well, I want to provide more things than I had growing up. But she said, things are not what children want. Children want time and they want connection. And those latchkey children that you're describing, they call them in America latchkey children, who come home to an empty home. Often their mums and dads are working so hard, but they're earning almost less than the father used to earn in the 50s, and his dollar could buy so much more. They could afford a nice house in the suburbs and a comfortable car, and they didn't have huge materialism and massive malls and takeout food, but they had really good, healthy food cooked at home and a simple, connected lifestyle. Gosh, I know which one I would rather have. It's the connection that counts, isn't it?
I think yes. I think more or less you're sort of seeing like a reemergence of that line of thought and thinking, which great, like thank God for that. But at the same time, the force sort of like on the other side of that is so strong and it's so convincing, especially when it's hidden behind the sentiment of empowerment, like personal empowerment
Yes.
and agency and so on and so forth. And when the like the primary messaging that's aimed at both women and men through like mainstream media and so on and so forth is that like, oh, like loyalty doesn't exist anymore and da 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 da, and like take care of yourself first, put yourself first, that type of thing. It's a very strange culture, and I think to me, who's sort of like been looking at it, looking like from the outside in, I almost like saw both the rise and now like the eventual fall of, well, everything really. So this process to me it's very obvious, like what we're talking about right now. To me, it's very apparent. But I feel like if we ask the person who's in the thick of this culture, like let's say like relatively young nowadays, and if we tell them like, well, like do you like, what do you think about women? Or like if you ask like most women, what do you think about men? I feel like most of the answers you would get genuinely from young people today would mostly be negative, like would mostly carry some sort of negative connotation, where they will say like, oh, um, I feel like most of them would say like, oh, like like men have everything, they don't deserve crap. Excuse my language. And like men would also say something like, oh, like these hoes ain't loyal or whatever, like this slangy, terrible way that like. It's not like they actually have thought this through, right? They're just repeating what they hear on the internet 24/7. Even the language that's used nowadays, how people like choose to talk, right? It's almost like me as someone who's into physiognomy, for example, and like what we do is like we'll take a person's physiognomy type or an archetype and we'll put them into sort of like a group of people. It's almost like what it feels to me is like talking to the same person over and over and over and over again with just like
Wow.
slightly different variations, right? So when I hear someone word to word repeat an opinion that they're subscribed to, and I know at least 150,000 other people who are also subscribed to that very same opinion from that very same source, well, I think to myself, well, like what gives, right? If all we do is rehash the content we see online or that's fed to us through media and so on and so forth, right? Then that means that most of the people, or at least that implies that most of the people who are consuming this content don't, well, probably have a dysfunctional family. Probably they come from a
Yes.
dysfunctional family because they don't have that backbone that's going to tell them, like, son, like, what verbiage are you using? Like, what does this
Yes.
mean, right? That's
Don't
my only
talk like
conclusion.
that. Yeah,
Exactly.
don't talk like that. If you yeah, if you denigrate somebody, but then you're willing to sleep with them. I remember when I was in mainstream, Robbie Williams, the singer from the UK, was young and it was his kind of moment in the sun. I don't know if you know Robbie Williams, but he had some big hits back in the day. And he
I
was in
do.
the green room and he was getting ready to go on. And he was talking to the makeup girl. I had to go into, because I was doing the news cuts before and after his interview. And I just heard him talking to her and putting down this New Zealand woman that he'd met, and it had made some headlines in the, and she was obviously fairly, it was sad. She was thinking that sleeping with this ridiculous would-be rocker, was going get her some kind of validation. I just felt she was probably a really lost person. But here he was having this 4 or 5 day sort of affair that was on the New Zealand headlines and a bit of gossip. But he was running her down. And I walked out of that green room thinking, what a disgusting male. I mean, he's using her body in effect, and he's not valuing her in any way. And thereby he's not valuing himself in any way. And what a horrible way to talk about this. And there's been so much of that for these young people. That's been something that's come in an enormous wave since then, whereas the way I was brought up was to really value what you have to offer a man and to expect the highest standards from that man, and not to give your body to a man unless you really felt that, well, I mean, mine was very conservative. It was, to look at it in the context of a commitment and a marriage, which is extraordinary nowadays, because that social conditioning has been to use a sexual connection as just almost a throwaway meal. It's just, whereas it's your body that you're allowing this deep intimacy with. I think we have to move back to a world wherein you as a man value your body, and I as a woman value my body, and I value what I have to offer, and I'm willing to wait and do due diligence and not rush into things. I mean, men who went off to World War I and World War II, sometimes the women waited 5 years for their man to come back. But they grew through letters and writing, they grew to know a side of each other. You never know someone until you've spent a long time living with them, but that's the joy of a relationship. But the point being, when they did come together, there were these two adults who had great self-respect and had respect for one another. And I think from that, the flower of something quite different flows, and it's not just some transient physical satisfaction in the moment. Is that too old-fashioned?
No, I don't think it is. Well, I feel like a lot of young people nowadays would find that almost like how they would say, probably cringe or funny. But the truth of the matter is, it's not like we're talking about it in a nostalgic sense where, oh, it used to be so great and now it's da. But this is something that's doing irreversible damage to newer generations, and that irreversible damage comes in different forms, and it comes in the form of, let's say, if you look at the statistics of depression and loneliness in like young men nowadays, it is incredible what you'll find. And it's so funny because like those same people are convinced that they live in like this taboo-less society where, like sexual expression is like, incentivized, and you can be free and you can do whatever. But when everyone's free to do whatever, I feel like they very quickly find out that, like there are no more boundaries to respect in sort of like there's no nightly code that they have to follow, right? That's sort of like lost in all of this chaos and confusion that's caused by, well, you can be whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, no one has any sort of responsibility towards another. Like, let's say I'm a male, right, and I'm physically more capable, right, than a woman, but then I have a society that's telling me, you know what, Jack, you have absolutely no responsibility to protect or sort of like provide some sort of protection or some sort of like feeling of security and safety for your fellow human who is sort of like weaker than you. And then you see these videos of like, I don't know, like, sometimes like women getting beat up on the street and no one's helping them, to that type of thing, right? So when you're creating this degenerate society, and I, it's also like I will also, get into the women as well. I'm very critical of them too, in a sense, but primarily I'm still critical of the males, because it's the male population who determines the laws and boundaries and the rule sets of, at least culturally, right, of the society that they create. So if the males are like okay with it, then of course like the female will lash out in the sense. But a lot of the female youth, let's say in the West, are also now stuck in this state of like the temptation is absolutely incredible, in the sense of like, why would I choose to have a family, right, when I can choose to get on a website like OnlyFans and be provided for the rest of my life by basically doing nothing, right? So the exchange there is, am I willing to enter into this deal where I will compromise and sacrifice the family unit to have whatever I want. And like if I have enough money, I don't need a man in my life in that sense, right? That's what they think, right? It's not true, of course, but how they think about it is like, well, if I need protection, I'll just call the police. If I need someone to come in my home and fix something, I'll just call a repair guy, right? I don't need a capable, strong, reliable husband who's sort of like but the problem of that sort of lifestyle is that you never receive that emotional shelter still because you don't have one, right?
No.
And when you don't, that's when things start getting sour, right? And that's where we see like what the lifestyle is like, in most, first world countries nowadays. That's sort of like what we see now. And it's crumbling down into a crisis of sexuality and a crisis of gender and self-identity so much that like it's like the fall of Rome all over again, right?
Yes. When you say getting sour, what did you mean by getting sour? Elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, we're not like it's a society that is not receiving the motherly love and the intuitive benefits of a happy and virtuous female population. So that's a society devoid of any sort of empathy. That's a society devoid of any sort of intuitive connection with the divine and with God. It's a society that
Yes.
can't interface with God, basically, right? It's a
Oh,
godless society.
this is so interesting because you see, if you I talked about those couples who waited, say, in the war, or even generally in that era, in the 1930s and 40s, it was societally expected that a woman would wait and find the right man and look for that man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, and have the self-respect and the self-esteem to guard that for that man. So let's say that is really old-fashioned. And certainly when I was younger, I railed against that because all my friends were not that. And my upbringing was that. So it was quite a dichotomous thing for me. But what I've realized is when you really come together with somebody in that deepest place of respect, with a certain amount of, I would say, containment of being able to give it time to develop and open up and mature, and not rush into something for a very quick momentary pleasure. When you say, I want to get to know this person first, there's such a chance for human beings to know the sexual connection as, I think, a path to something that is God-given, is the phrase I would say, is really from the divine. But it comes with a certain delayed gratification. M. Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, wrote, the greatest gift you can give your children is the gift of learning delayed gratification, because gratification is when I want that and I want it now and I'll have it no matter what. And so this is where all of the thieving and exploiting others and being unethical and having no moral code, but it also has a certain sense of theft sexually, when I want that woman now, or I want that man now, and I'll just throw myself at him. It's like eating the icing on the cake. There's no nutrition there at all. But if you can wait, and if you can explore this incredible opening of two people as they start to build trust in one another, and they share ideas, and they wait even though there is desire there. And then when it is the right time for fulfillment, there can be a doorway that opens to something that is almost unable to be described. And I think that is what the sexual gift was given to man and woman ultimately for the exploration of a pathway to something that is divine in our natures. What's your feeling there, Jack?
I think that's true. That's true in a spiritual sense and also in a physical sense. And I'll try to sort of like explain what I mean. And I think us as a society, and us as human beings, look, okay, so let's talk about, like, if we demanded sort of like the going back to all of that we spoke about, even if we like agree on it, it's very difficult to tell a society that was grown into their sexuality like so early on, and they explored so much and so on and so forth, to tell that. But what I would do, and I feel like inherently we all know this, there's a very big difference between the sexual act, so the full sexual act, and sexual favors, right? Right now, those two things have been, mystified for a reason. It's like, oh, it's like one of the same thing. No, it's not, right? So let's say if you have a young society who's also like, like sexually curious, right? At least the sex ed that you can give to these people is like, okay, I understand that if you don't want to wait 5 years because it's sort of like beyond your programming right now, or something like along those lines. But how about we just differentiate in a healthy manner, the meaning of a sexual favor and a full sexual intercourse, right? That could fix a lot of issues too, because this exchange of divine energy and this exchange of like sort of like trust and so on and so forth, right, doesn't always need to happen in every or any kind of sexual encounter or intimate encounter you have with another person. And when
Yes.
we say it's sort of like a portal to divinity, we actually mean that. Like if you study the effects of regular sexual intercourse between the same two people, right? So a male and a female, on both of their bodies, it's fascinating. So what you will find there, what you will uncover, is that the female body, and this is all science, this is not like heebie-jeebie voodoo stuff, right? The female body over time, it secretes certain hormones and so on and so forth, minerals, so on and so forth, that the male body absorbs through touch of skin, through contact, and the male body is strengthened by doing so. But for the female to provide this sort of thing, there is a sort of a what's the word for it? Like acclimation or acclimatization. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but
Yes, acclimatization.
yeah,
Acclimatization.
acclimatization period where they have to sort of like remain, like sexually active only between, one another for this thing to occur. And and what this causes, let's say in the male body, increases testosterone, reduces inflammation, provides all kind of minerals, because when the male basically partakes, right, they're the primary giver, right? So they give their life force, their energy, their life essence, so on and so forth. And if they sort of like don't get that back eventually, it sort of like weakens them in a sense. I always talk
Yes.
about how the primary predictor of a male's success in life, and I feel like this is such a funny and paradoxical and ironic example, but a primary indicator of a male's confidence and sense of self-worth and general success is uh, uh, during like early years, like teen years and so on and so forth, success on the sexual market, right? So success with women. So early on, women have the incredible weight of the responsibility of basically being the curators of which man, quite literally physically, gets upgraded. So whichever man they choose as worthy and virtuous and so on and so forth, and basically worthy of being upgraded, they can quite literally give them the gift of more confidence, so on and so forth. So these people, let's say, how I always say, and I get called a lot of things for saying this, by the way, by both men and women, mostly men, who just don't understand it and for some reason don't want to agree with it. But I feel like this is objectively true. In a society where young women are inspired to and are incentivized to reward non-virtuous behavior in young men with sexual favors, they will grow, they're in the same age range, so they will grow alongside these males that they rewarded, and these males will be in their age range for the rest of their lives. So these males will go on, the males they empowered, let's say, to places of power and authority and so influence, right? And
Yes.
because these males, right, have no sort of like sense of empathy towards the women that just threw themselves at them, these same males will start disempowering these women and mistreating them. And then women will come out and say, well, all men are like this way or that way, and they're like feminism, da, da, da. But the truth is, you have to go down back to the roots of the problem. And the root of the problem is, why is our society inspiring young women to reward non-virtuous behavior in men?
Yes. 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 That's so interesting. I remember something my father said. He said he as he was getting older, he said, "Oh, you know, there are lots of those young, sort of sexy boys around, the sexy boys." But he said, and women will be drawn to those. But what's interesting is as women mature, they often look for something very different in men. They look for actually what you were describing earlier, people who are much more solid and not so flighty and not so egoic, and there can almost be, just as there can be a fading of that flower of youth in young women, there can be the same fading in those sort of men who in their youth are very, kind of have that sexual aura, but they often don't age so well. And I don't know why that is. Actually, I'd love to talk about the physiognomy and the face, what you see in the
Oh,
faces
gladly.
of it. Yeah. And what I got from that conversation was, seek out a man of character, seek out a man who has, for me, it's important, somebody who has a good moral code and somebody I can relate to, and there's some intelligence there and humor and obviously, I like to feel attracted to my partner, but it was those other qualities in him that have really drawn me. That he is someone I can discuss anything with, and he has a great sense of his own self and a good sense of his moral code. Those things to me are far more alluring. They're really solid. You can.
Yeah.
Well, what did you say earlier? If a woman is feeling she's with a man who's solid and there's a protective male and he has solid values, I think that's when a woman does very much start to blossom into who she is as well.
Of course, of course. I call it. There's a concept that I've sort of like created, but it's not that like, oh, I made it up, right? It's a spiritual concept. And I advise it and I teach it to men, young men especially. We call it priming the aura, like priming your aura. And this happens when you have a sort of relationship like we described with a female who sort of like you contain her essence and you allow it to sort of like blossom into increased intuition, increased health, so on and so forth. And going back to like that for a tiny bit, because I feel like it's important for context of any things we might say now in the future. It's very important to understand that like if you just look at it like, okay, like there's 10 people living in a cave, right? There's like 2 women and 8 men, right? The men who those women choose to have sex with, they will quite literally physically be more fit, more healthy, more testosterone, better bone density, less inflammation, more confidence, more self-worth, more winning momentum, right? So those men are most likely, if we predict through behavior, they're going to become the primary needle movers of that society. So if we don't want the primary needle movers of our society to be men who are of questionable morals, we have to start asking the question, well, okay, why is this thing so heavily incentivized? Why are certain sort of like criminal and lifestyles incentivized and presented to the youth as attractive, when in the
Yes.
past what was presented to them as attractive was knightly vigor and knightly morals and knightly virtue, right? Who were
Yes.
girls attracted to in the past? Let's say in the medieval era, right? It is sort of like the knightly, strong, sort of like male.
Athletic. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and not some gangbanger, right? That can't put their pants on properly.
Yeah.
Like, and when we say, um, when we ask that question, and when we say, you know, we can't control what you're attracted to, I always ask the question, but do you really know that? Because if you look at statistics on how culture and cultural environment and messaging from music and so on and so forth affects the choice in mate and in partner, in the youth, I think you'll find some very important statistics there, like very interesting statistics. The
Such
effect
as,
is huge.
yeah,
Well,
just give me some
the
examples.
the essence of it is whatever society celebrates, because this is how young women think. Young women, regardless of how they feel about something or someone, they need external validation that their inner thoughts are true. So for example, if I like someone, like it's a spark. I'm a woman, I like someone, there's a spark. um what I do is I don't immediately engage with that person, right? What I do is I look around that person and I seek external validation for my existing biases. So I'll ask my friends, hey, what do you think about this guy? They'll tell me, oh, he's such a nice person. He's so funny. Da, da, da. So the external shapes the materials, the mental materials that a woman needs to sort of like create the sense of bravery and boldness to pursue something that's already, she already has the pre-existing bias that, like, okay, this is an attractive thing in this man. Like, even if it's just physical attraction, like, just like, at least in the sense, in a physiognomy sense, just physical attraction doesn't even exist without proper reasoning behind it, right? So if you're attracted to someone, you're attracted to their sort of like their archetype, like what they look like, what kind of aura and energy they exude. Like if you're sort of like, if you have, if you can synchronize with them well, in almost like a hormonal level, right? So even that carries within it some sort of like secret, subtle hint that okay, maybe there's something there, right? Because we're different people and we find different types of people attractive, right? um so it's it goes down all the way to this like early on thing where this is why most trauma treated by psychotherapists and so on and so forth today is childhood trauma, right?
Yes.
It's childhood trauma and PTSD. So childhood trauma is largely unaddressed in our society today, all of our societies.
And on so many levels, there's been this societal breakdown of the moral code. When there was a very widespread belief in God, there were certain morals that, even for those people who were in traumatizing backgrounds, it could give something to cling on to. There's so little now, and for a lot of the young, it's what's coming out of these machines. So I wanted to address two things before we move on to the physiognomy. For a young man listening who's going, I am lonely and I would love to be able to know a woman in a different sense, in an honoring sense, somebody I could look up to and she look up to me. I would love to know what that's like. If he is a young man who has been introduced early on to pornography, for example, before his brain's been able to deal with it, and so many of the young are, and it can very quickly, I gather, hit in as a kind of addiction. I remember a counselor saying to me, for some sensitive souls, being introduced to pornography too early can have the same impact as a child or a young person who is sexually abused physically. For some people, just even the visual impact of that can have very traumatic resonances, or they can become addicted to it. What do you say to those young who've been so denuded, really, through the technology we have, the exposure, the far too early exposure to all of that, and very graphic exposure in some cases? Do you have any of those reaching out to you saying,
A lot.
how do I get out of this? Yeah, I feel really sorry for them. It's
So many, yeah.
wow.
Like most, I would say like 95% of any sort of like physiognomy reading or sort of like session you will do will be with young males. And there's a reason for that because, well, increasingly I feel young men are feeling less and less capable and more sort of like confused and rejected by society as a whole. So if,
Yes, that's been a program. That's been a
yeah,
program. Poor women, or women should be strong, or let's empower women, let's empower blacks. Where are the men? Where are the men being honored? It's
yeah, I
terrible.
feel like they feel like the world and society is largely against them, and they don't
Ah,
feel like they're being heard. And even if they are heard, no one cares because they're looked at as like expendable worker ants, that type of thing. But
it's
like
terrible.
if someone comes to me and asks me, well, I want to have this sort of relationship, but I like the very first advice I always give them is that you need to become worthy, right? And to them this is like a confusing thing. What do you mean? And when you're young, young man, like the hormones all over the place, like you just want to go out there and like the world is like this explosion of colors, right?
Yes.
um there's like so many temptations and so on and so forth. The first thing I would say a young man needs to focus on is, I always tell them, you don't have to change how all women think. Okay, you can't. You just have to find one person who is acceptable to you in the way they carry themselves and how they think and so on and so forth. But first, to get to that point, right, you need certain competences. Like you need to become competent in well, things like communication. You have to better yourself, right? Because the only currency of exchange a young man has against the world today is their potential, and how they market that potential, and how they first of all produce that potential and increase that potential, but then how they market it, right, to the opposite sex. So it's not easy. It's definitely difficult, especially if you're someone who, again, has not had early on success on the sexual market. This is only like a small percentage of men or teen or boys or whatever. um, then you sort of like have to go on this journey at a very early young age where, okay, like I have to self improve and sort of like go against my natural hormones and so on and so forth, and refocus that energy into, well, creating a presentable version of myself. And once I do, I will be able to provide that sort of emotional containment to attract a woman of virtue. And when they do that, great. The best couples I know, the happiest couples I know, are always the ones who met at a very early, the young age, maybe in school, and they've been together forever, like 20 years, 30 years. You see it all the time. And the worst couples I know, they're not couples for long. You know what I mean? They just sort of like rush into it and then they get out. I also always say, like, when if a young man or woman comes to me and they're like very enamored by someone else, and they're like, oh, like I love them so much, and like I always tell them, you don't understand what love is, because if you cannot possibly love someone and not be loved back, because love in and of itself, like as a concept, is your innate ability to see yourself within another. So there's no such thing as one-sided love, and they just never get it the first few times I tell them this. Like it just doesn't exist. Like, okay, you can be enamored by someone, you can like have certain sympathies and so on and so forth, but if we're talking about love in the sense of divine, godly connection type of love, it's like you see someone, you look them in the eyes, they look you in the eyes, and that's it. That's all it takes. So
Yes.
becoming worthy is sort of like priming your aura to become primed. That's how I call it, I guess, is to become open to the experience of falling in love and having someone fall in love with you, and someone becoming enamored by you. But first, you have to position yourself as a male, um, well, in a way where that becomes a possibility, right? You can't just sit at home and be like, well, where is the love of my life? Where are you, my dear? Like, you have to position yourself. You have to get out there, do things, be active, take initiative, so on and so forth, and it'll happen.
Beautiful. What about at the other end of the spectrum from, so just before we move on from pornography, what do you say to someone who feels they are addicted to pornography, for example?
Mm,
How do you
mm.
help them? What help is there?
Well, it's quite
Because
visceral,
it's
and
lonely. It must be very
yes,
lonely.
it's
Yeah.
very lonely. It's very lonely, and the rising of things like OnlyFans and all these platforms where
Yes.
men get in there and just like um, it's a very visceral thing. And I like when it comes to psychotherapy and therapy, let's look at it from that angle. I'm a very big fan of under dramatizing the effect of things, because the placebo effect there is your friend. So let's say you mentioned that you know a person or researcher or so on and so forth who said like the effects of pornography on the young mind is akin to like sexual abuse, and most probably that is true, right? Like this is sort of like a empirically provable, researchable thing. But if you actually take that and not make it into a big deal, if we talk in like casual sense, if you sort of like under dramatize the effects of that, it's very easy to get out of it. It's like telling a smoker, like someone who's addicted to cigarettes, like like it's really difficult to like just stop smoking. But the secret key to stop any sort of self-deprecating behavior is no longer identifying with it. So for example, a smoker or someone who used to be an alcoholic who is now free of alcohol for 5 years. They give them little badges, the little coins or whatever that says 5 years. Congratulations, Eugene, right? That actually works against this healing, because they still retain the identity of someone who is addicted to alcohol. They just have now the willpower to resist it. So their energy is
Yes.
low. They don't feel the same. But if I can convince you to convince yourself to say, you know what, I am no longer an alcoholic because I no longer drink alcohol. It's just part of my new identity. My identity is not someone who drinks alcohol at all. So why would I have the need or the physical need to consume it? That's it. So the shift in identity is more important than, like, the bigger of a deal you make the healing process and the therapy process. And some therapists, unfortunately, nowadays are taught to do this to extend the visitations from their clients because they want to make more money off of them, right? The more big of a deal you make out of something, the more dramatically your client or your beneficiary is going to experience it. So if you just like downgrade it in their minds and make it small, you're like, you know what? Just change your identity. You were a smoker yesterday. Do you have some sort of responsibility towards the world to go through this incredible journey or like climb Mount Everest or something to excuse yourself for changing your mind? No, you don't. You can just change your mind like that with a flick of your finger.
That's beautiful. That goes right back to the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives
Yes.
and the drama in them. And gosh, that's really, really interesting. Now, the other thing, talking to some young people, I know there are some young men in particular who have waited longer than that they've waited perhaps into their early 30s or their 20s or their late 20s and are more conservative and are hoping to meet that right person. Is that unusual in your experience? Because I've come across a few cases of that lately when I've been talking. I love talking to young people.
Yeah. I would be lying if I said I looked at myself who has the willpower or the mental know-how to go that long without the touch of a woman, right?
Mhm.
And I admire like people who have the sort of like the inner will and integrity to pursue that level of purity, right? But I think the rule set and the rules don't really change, at least for men, right? Again, if you're looking to attract the right, and I'll sort of like link this to my other concept. I always say like make space for the mystical to occur, and that means if you want a car, build a garage. Like that type of thing. Like if you can become the best garage that's out there, right? Or just an attractive garage, someone's gonna park their car in there. Like it's just a matter of time. The better the garage, usually, the better the car that's in it, right? It's like an
Mm.
unequivocal truth, right? If you have some sort of like a rundown place, like when you look at it from the outside, if you look at it from like this quantum superposition state, what's more likely to be in a trashy garage, a trashy vehicle, right? What's more likely to be in a beautiful, get it, like a beautiful vehicle? So if
Absolutely.
you can just, if you want flowers, don't buy the flowers. If we want to be given flowers, I mean, buy a vase or a vase, or how do you pronounce that? I'm not sure.
Vase.
Right? So
Yes.
yeah, buy a vase, right? When I come over to your house, like, well, that's a beautiful vase. It's sort of like wasted there with no flowers in it. So next time I'll come, I'll get you some flowers. That's how the magic happens.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I was raising that issue because there is acknowledged across America now as well. There is a growing conservatism, which is also embodied in a swing back to a vast increase in interest in Jesus and the church and God and what Christianity stands for, which is interesting given that there's also this invasion of Islamism in the West. It was intriguing this Easter that's just gone, the numbers of people even across Ireland and France and Spain who were out marching. So there with all of this looseness that's been going on for decades and encouraged in order to break down the family, I realize now, and the women who are disconnected, out working and overstressed and think they have to be working. I look back now and think, gosh, I was sucked in. I genuinely thought you must have a career. You must be a mother with a career, until I didn't, until there was a point where I went, I'm missing out on my children. And I am so thankful that I stopped and was a full-time mother for a while. But those earlier years when I was working in mainstream television, what was interesting, Jack, was I would talk to businesswomen who came on, and it was surprising how many would use this phrase, well, I was just a mother, and then I thought I need to do something else with my life. But I would always intuitively stop them and go, wait a minute, you're not just a mother. The mothering is the most important job in the world. And yet when it came to me having children, I fell right into the same trap. Not saying I'm just a mother, but the societal pressure, I need to have something else to be, what you said, validated. We need to start validating our mothers and honoring our fathers who are perhaps more conservative in this generation. Are you noticing there's a rise in conservatism?
I am, but I'm also noticing that I feel like it's so unpopular nowadays to seek collective happiness. Like when we talk about, let's talk about mothers, for example. It's paradoxical and it's ironic, but I feel like, again, when the female is in this contained state, right? Like, let's say within the egg, right? That's where usually they become more than a mother, because that's where they discover their hidden talents, they intuit new skills, because they're allowed to do so within the safety of a homestead that's financially and materially taken care of. Problem, I guess, nowadays is that everyone is so overworked that you never get that time alone at home, right? Like if you're a family and both mommy and daddy works, right? By the time mommy and daddy come back home, everyone's like drained and exhausted. And then the
Yes.
children suffer from that, because the children, like, the exhausting part of parenting, I would say, at least from my experience with like doing therapy with couples and parents and so on and so forth, with problematic children as well, not just your average case, it is the first few years before you instill certain agency within your children, right, where they go from liabilities, so to speak, familial liabilities, to helpers, right?
Yes.
And then you have these little helper gnomes around the home, and then suddenly, sort of like it sort of like becomes a little softer, and then the female can like really like blossom into like, well, I've always wanted to write a book, and then suddenly you have the next J.K. Rowling, and like, woo, like the family benefits in this mystical way, where it's not like she built her career and she spent 25 years doing so and just toiled in the mud and muck, and because women don't perform well in these types of situations where it's all about brutality and aggression and just drive and relentlessness, they perform really well when they can sort of like cast the magic of their own intuition. So let's say it could be a small thing. Like you could start, I don't know, creating a little vlog or blog and actually start making more than your husband does with it. Like nowadays, you can achieve that from the
Yes.
comforts of your home. I
But
think
they're
this is
not in
very
a
important.
brutal, cold office with horrible overhead lights
Yes. Yes.
and just trying to pretend that they can keep up with men, which was
But
really what the feeling was when I was a young lawyer. I have to prove that I can be as good as the men. You know what I mean? It
Liz,
was
I'll tell you even
ridiculous.
more. Like they're really smart. The people who are sort of like instilling this corporate office culture, they're really smart in a behavioral psychology sense. And I can notice this and say this because, well, I've dabbled in all sorts of right, like psychological tricks and so on and so forth. Um, what they do is they take the motherly energy of the young female when she's the most empathetic, the most motherly, the most naturally inclined to caretake for something that is beyond them, is greater than the self. Then they attach this motherly instinct to the corporation where they're
Ah,
employed. And then the women that are always put into like these places like, oh, like HR and like we're like a big family, and they recreate this whole sentiment where like, oh, don't give your motherly life force and energy to your actual family. We're your family, the
yes.
corporation, and we love you so much. Until you're fired, then we don't need you anymore. Good luck. You don't even get a maternity leave, like a proper one anymore, right? It's crazy what they do.
This is so interesting.
It's energy
It's,
harvesting, right? On a
yes,
very, very subtle and
yeah,
deep level. And this is not something that just happens. This is something that's of deliberate design. And a
yes.
lot of very smart people, people who are smarter than you and I, have thought through and created this sort of like pyramidal scheme system that exploits the best years and the best life force energies of the youth, and
It's,
also disempowers them to rage against them later on because they're drained of it. They just like want to retire. I just want to retire. That's it.
It's so obvious when you start to see it. It's so obvious, the manipulation. It's well known now that, what was it, the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds, somebody in one of those wealthy families worked out, well, if we put the women out to work after World War II, we'll get double the tax take. We'll get a whole lot more money. And so it was inherently exploitative, but the cost has been enormous. We've talked about latchkey kids who come home and unlock the house and nobody's home for them. And as you say, the parents coming in exhausted, and the price of just rubbish takeaway food instead of home cooked food and a meal around the table, and connection with what has gone on in the day, and the space for values or God. It's just not there. It is a form of harvesting. And when you see it, when I look back, I think, damn you, I'm intelligent, but I fell totally for the societal structuring or manipulations. It's really frustrating. So what do you say to young women? What do you say? Because I said to my own daughter, have your children young and really focus on family. It's
Well, I would teach them. Would you like a sort of like a sneak peek in the psychology and like the thinking patterns of, let's call them like the elite? Would you like to know like how the elite view the world? And I feel like it'll make a lot more sense to like the average person when we discuss it from that standpoint. So let's
I'd
say,
love that, Jack.
yeah, you
Mm.
have a bunch of rats, and you create this elaborate labyrinth for them, right? And they get fed if they follow the rule set, right?
Mm.
um, Now, and you're sort of, you have like this bird's eye view, and you can see like everything that's going on, right? You're like the influential person. You can like take a rat out, you put a new one in, whatever you want, right? Who, or I guess not who, but which rat is the most studied and admirable of the bunch? It's always the one that becomes a deviant and doesn't follow the rules, right? So when you look at that case, right, when you look at that rat, you're like, okay, why do the elites love theater, entertainment, actors, actresses, so on and so forth? Like it's a like the creative, artsy element is a very big part of the presentation of the world for them. So when I look at the world, to me, the hardened criminal who has found this super creative solution to cheat the very system that as a whole is a cheat that I've created for them, to me becomes an admirable individual. So when I always tell people, if you realized just how much of a game our current world is, for those who are on the top end of it, then everything starts to make sense, because the admirable quality of someone who's stuck in a labyrinth is not that they somehow followed the rules of this labyrinth perfectly and then they come home and watch their TV and go to bed. The admirable and interesting and entertaining person that everyone wants to meet and shake hands with in your, let's say, reality show or so on and so forth, is the one who departs from the programming. And that is why, let's say, in mainstream media and in different TV shows and TV series and like even the movie Matrix and so on and so forth, the emphasis is on the person who decides to stop participating. And when they do that, they immediately become a favorite, which is strange, like to the system. But at the same time, there could only be a few favorites. If everyone becomes like that, then this whole system crumbles and the deviants can no longer be researched. The deviants can no longer show themselves if everyone's a deviant. So you need to keep the labyrinth going, but at the same time, you need to sort of like create these sweethearts, like people to fall in love with, like, oh, like she ascended to the top of Hollywood with, through questionable means. That's a favorite of mine, right? Yes, it's dark when you look at it from that's a but I think it's important to understand the mental state of the people who are on the top 0.01% of this crazy world we live in, right?
I mean, they're really like in the Wizard of Oz, when Toto runs behind and pulls back the curtain, and there's this ridiculous wizard creature just trying to manipulate everything. They are that. Who do you name them? Who are they? That people with the Pope's death talk about the Black Pope and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, but and the Bank of International Settlements in
I
Switzerland. Who are
I
they?
honestly don't know, and I
Mm.
know like I've read a lot about it. The end result of my research is that it doesn't really matter, um, because the gap is too wide between the average person, and I see myself as the average person or the average human, and them is very wide, and I feel like um, these are people who don't like to be named or seen, and I think everyone should do them the favor of not doing so, right? Because there are how do I say this? Like in the end, it only matters what you control and what you can do and what you're able to like what kind of change you're able to do. Because there's a rule set. This is something I've noticed, right? There's a rule set that says you need to allow the chessboard to unfold itself. So if like as soon as you see like deviant behavior on the chessboard, like say there's a piece of the game that doesn't follow the rules that you gave it, right? And it's
Mm.
causing all sorts of chaos, right? And the game doesn't work anymore, right? You have to let that unfold up to a certain degree. And no doubt that, the people who are on top, they have, like we said, like a certain admiration for people who are able to do that. But you also have to have the understanding of like um, these people are also under the same system that they've created. So it doesn't matter who they are because the system is designed in a way that they will be replaced in a split second, like in a heartbeat,
Mm.
right? Because none of them are integral to the system. So everyone's coming out and they're like, oh, it's them, it's these guys, it's those guys. Yes, there are some, how to say, regular players, no doubt, No doubt. And there's legacy and heritage and bloodlines and all this kind of conspiratorial stuff that you can go into. Not even actually, why do we even call it conspiratorial? Yeah, it's basically like that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because it's the system that enforces that, like, there always has to be someone at this particular spot with this particular interest. And how those people work, they're very smart, Liz. Like, they're so smart. Like, you can't help but admire them, in a sense, in a very dark and cynical way. But it's true, because what they do and how they manage business, and this is the school, the mystical school that's taught to them, I fear. How they do business is, there are no contracts. Contracts are for plebs, right? There's no such thing as a contract. There's not even a handshake. There's not even like a strange look across the room. What they do is they're taught mutual interest. So let's say, I always give the example of a boxing fight. There's a boxing fight, and there's 4 judges, and no judges have been paid off whatsoever. Okay, no judge has been paid off to vote sort of in the benefit of either fighter, right? But the place where the boxing ring is in, right, and the people who are in attendance, all of that is owned, right, by one boxer's like cousin or something like that, right?
Yes.
Right? And this is public information. So all they have to do is give public information. This is what's happening. There's a boxing match. You will be the judge here. Good luck, sir. Good luck to you. Now, one of these 4 judges, right, they'll be like, well, you know what? If it's a close match, I could change my mind slightly to, appeal a little bit to the overlords, right? That's why they call it, like, sort of like a sacrifice, right? We're making a very basic example here, but they'll do this, and then they'll do it again, and then they'll do it again, and then they'll do it again, and suddenly, they will find things like the algorithm and lucky findings of cash and money and yada yada yada. They'll find themselves blessed with fortune, right? So this is sort of like what it means when we say to sell your soul to the devil. That's what it means. And
Yes.
these things happen, these handshakes happen on, they don't have to happen on. I remember I was talking to a friend about this, and they had this whole theory where, like, all of these like conspiratorial things happened through telepathic handshakes and communication, because like there was no proof of any sort of conspiracies ever coming to light. And like when I told them this, they were like, yeah, I think your theory is a little bit like more objective. Like, this is how it happens. And you and I, we don't even need to know one another. If you serve the same purpose, and if you've passed the same school of mysticism, let's call it that, okay? Like, if you've gone through the same school of mysticism that teaches you how to identify and maneuver these things through symbolic acts, and through the means of identifying these lucrative opportunities, you and I could never meet one another ever, but conspire against the world and its systems so efficiently and so effectively without any evidence present. We just can do it, no problem. So this is, when we talk about the shadow empire, this is the shadow empire. It's a conglomeration of the largest group of people with mutual interests and no link whatsoever. That's the system.
So many questions drop out of that. And recall, I remember in the COVID-19 lockdowns under Jacinda Ardern, somebody telling me, and she was in Parliament, she said, almost nothing out of Jacinda Ardern's office is in writing. That's how clever she is. Everything's done more verbally, because she didn't want any tracing of the evil she was doing. So there are shades of what you're saying. And then, when you talk about somebody suddenly gets benefits, I mean, that's how the whole system of music and Hollywood is set up as well, isn't it? On another level down.
Now they can standardize it too. It's why I say I admire the intellect that goes behind it, because when you really decipher what it is, now it's sort of like, well, in the past was dispersed and more difficult. So you had to use like symbolism, and you had to sort of like you say, like if I'm a student of that art, right? Like it's verbal, and then it's sign based, and then it's encrypted, like that type of thing. But nowadays, I can just let the algorithm decide who gets the vote and who gets the voice. So if you're someone who's creating dissonance, but dissonance in what they would call the elites in a respectable manner, right? You will receive said benefits. But then you will be asked at some point, right, to, pick their guy, right? That's the way it happens. It's so incredibly subtle, and it's so real that it's unreal. Like it exists so it exists so much that it doesn't even exist. And that is, in my opinion, the highest form of left-hand magic. The highest form.
Left-hand magic, what do you mean when you say that? I assume something.
Well, left-hand mysticism always has this formulaic or ritualistic element to it, or material element to it. So what we talked about, let's say, in our previous conversation, we talked about money, and when we said, what you need will always sort of like be given to you, that type of thing. I didn't mean this. That is what I would call personally right-hand sorcery, right? Light sorcery. But this thing, because it has it has the theatrics, it has that grandiosity, the drama behind it, there's always like an element of sacrifice, there's always like this. That's why we call it, or why I call it, left hand.
It's fascinating. I mean, some of what you say would apply to, say, the Freemasons. I believe there are a lot of Freemasons still in New Zealand. We're really awash with it. Are there many in Georgia where you are?
If I'm honest, I have no idea. Like
Yeah.
I know like a lot of people. I was never into conspiracy at all, to be honest with you. Like some people, I know people who've researched this stuff for ages and decades. I never had an interest in that, because my foray into spirituality was purely out of like self-preservation first, and then sort of like an intuitive inclination and an intuitive desire. But it was never to like, oh, like I want to become influential and I want to know who are the people like who lead. So I honestly don't know if there are any here, and I honestly don't even know like what their final agenda and da, da, da. Obviously I've heard the same things that most people have. I can watch a documentary and they're interesting characters, but I'd be lying if I said I have some sort of like info that it's like groundbreaking and earth shattering and will reveal the sort of like the secret. I have no idea.
Yeah.
I really don't.
But when you hazard a guess, would you say that it is the depopulation agenda? They want really not too many of us. They don't like us. You call them elites. I call them parasite class. They like to feed off us. They like to feed off us, but they don't want us to be part of them, really. They like to see us as different and as very dispensable now. Do you look around at housing and how ugly it is, or you look at the way cities are spreading everywhere and there's no beauty, there's no thought given to it. There's a minimization of people now when they go into a bank. You're made to feel small and powerless, and it's just happening everywhere. And it wasn't like this growing up. It was a sense of we're all in this together. So there's been this sort of horrific downgrading where the few think they can look down on the many. That's never good for a society.
So I could tell you this. I guess this is my opinion, and this is why I think this way, is because of years of studying human psychology. I guess it's very difficult, even for the most let's say despicable characters, to be able to inflict great suffering on others without being convinced that they're actually being helpful or they're actually doing some sort of virtuous cause. And I'll tell you why. It's not just about, like, let's say you lack total empathy, right? And because you lack total empathy, you quite literally cannot interface with the suffering of another person, right? Let's just say that. Like, you just
Yes.
completely are devoid of empathy. But your ego still needs a contingency ideal or plan to somehow convince itself that you are actually a virtuous person. And this is the only sort of like a natural weakness that the human ego, something that these people feed into, has. Um, and because of this reality, all of the theatrics, all of the sort of like the drama and the artsy and the creative and stuff that we talk about, the purpose of said theatrics is this. It is to create a conviction or an idea that what is being done is being done for the good of the world, right? We can talk about forgetfulness as well. It's a very big theme in these circles that no one talks about. Um, why things like, the consumption of alcohol and different, like drugs and like culture states and so on and so forth is so important, is because forgetfulness is a very big part of the ritual. So let's say if I go and, again, excuse my language, get shit faced today and do some questionable things and send some questionable, messages to a few people, right? The forgetfulness thing, the fragmentation of the memory, when that happens, it's like, well, like, I don't even remember it happening, so it can't
Yes.
guilt trip me, right? And that is done, that can be harnessed to be done in a strategic manner, meaning it's a part of whatever's going on. So, if you participate, let's say, and if you have the conviction that you're, doing it for moral reasons, or, let's say you're doing it for something that's virtuous, and then you have this disassociation with whatever you've done as well afterwards, right? And there's whole, like, like a ritual sense to like the forgetfulness and the forgiving of past sins, and that's a very big theme in these
Mm.
circles, right? The release of past worries and sins and anxieties, that is done through forgetfulness, because there is not a human being alive on this earth that doesn't need to excuse their behavior and excuse themselves in front of their ego. Even if they have no functioning moral compass,
Oh,
no empathy whatsoever, their ego must sustain the notion that they're somehow virtuous.
wow. You mean even the worst? Gosh, that's an interesting statement. Even the worst criminals, or say that the internet at the moment is flooded with pictures of Islamic migrants within the heart of Europe, and they're very violent. A lot of
Yeah.
in these images, they're very violent. But I guess they would go away and now justify that is what their prophet wants them to be, and they're doing right by their prophet. That's what you're saying.
They are like the only way they can ever allow themselves to do the things that they do, that intuitively and instinctively and consciously they know causes suffering and pain, is that if they believe that the suffering and pain is worth the virtuous end goal or end result they're vying to achieve. That's the only way you can
Wow.
convince human psychology to do like these despicable things, right? Yeah.
Honestly, Jack, that is so interesting. A dear friend in Wellington, which is our capital, where all the bureaucrats are, his brother died suddenly. He went to see him and he was dead in his bed, and it was clearly from the jab. It's been not acknowledged in any way.
Mm.
That's another story. But he saw the head of our Ministry of Health, who was a fellow called, a very skinny little doctor called Ashley Bloomfield. And I mean skinny in that kind of shrunken way. It felt as if his whole soul was as desiccated and dried out as his body was. He wasn't a vital man who seemed to exude a goodness. But anyway, he was on our screens every day with Jacinda Ardern and pushing these things and saying that he was a Christian. Now, he was hyped by the media, so there was a manufactured sort of adoration of Ashley Bloomfield. And he was given a token knighthood, of course, afterwards, because they give themselves baubles afterwards. And he, my friend, whose dearest friend, his brother, had been killed by this jab, saw him one day in the street and went racing over to him and said, "What you did was wrong. It is evil what you've done. You killed my brother. What you pushed killed my brother. And you must atone for what you've done." It was along those lines. And he just looked at him and he said, "Well, that's not the feedback that I get. Lots of people really love me and love what I've done." And it was so inexplicable to this friend who's still in the full throes of the grief of losing his brother that I could see when he came home. I was staying with him and his wife, and I could see when he came home the confusion that a human could be so callous as Sir Ashley Bloomfield. But now you say this, in his own mind and as a Christian of all things, he has justified that the end justifies the means, that the getting everybody jabbed justifies a few people dying. Some kind of weird thinking like that, do you think?
Yeah, it's one's ability to sign off on the more rational the mind and the more like logic based the person, the more the greater the chance that they will make this moral mistake. At least from my experience, right? Because
Yeah.
it's easy to justify, like when you think of the world in terms of numbers, it's sort of like easy. And when you sort of like receive feedback, like he said, where would his mind be if he hadn't received the feedback, right? He would be reeling all over the place. But because he now has this sort of like cushion or like this, sort of like a comfortable bed of feathers that he can lay in, right? He can afford, some what he would call toxic negativity, quote unquote, once or twice from time to time. So, but I assure you, if that is the case, now I don't know like the specifics of all of it, of course, but if that is the case, the human conscience and the human intuition, which I call the lesser god, the two lesser gods that inhabit our bodies, he knows. And all of these people know. Like when they know that
Wow.
what they're doing is below their highest potential. And because they know this, they inflict how to say, like that's why their physiognomy changes. That's why this and that changes, right? That's why you see them sort of like almost like shrink, right, out on the outside, because deep down they know this. So even though their ego mind could logically create a narrative that allows them to think a certain way, it's the nagging conscience and the intuitive thought or vision or imagery that they get in their head that they're like, I deep down, like before I go to bed, I know that I probably should not have done this, and it was probably the wrong thing to do. um I don't wish that on anyone, I really don't.
Oh, I wish that on them so that they won't continue to do this sort of thing in
Oh
future
yeah.
lives.
Yeah,
They
if you
need to feel that
yeah,
discomfort.
yeah. The
Yeah,
the the reason I worded that way is because I want to convey just how much of anguish that is, right?
really.
Yeah, and this is the anguish that those people inflict upon themselves. And some of them like don't realize this until like later on, right? Like when they enter the twilight years of their lives, and then it sort of like starts coming back, and then they realize it's sort of like too late to go back, and like some of them double down, some of them like get like like health issues and stuff like this. Like this is unavoidable. um that's why it's important for people to follow your intuition and your conscience. Like if you can betray your ego, but you can't betray your conscience. No way.
Is it your conscience or is it the soul part of the human? You see, we all share. There is a purity of soul, even in the darkest of humans. And I've always believed that. Do you believe that?
um yes, I do, but not in a naive sense. Like I know and understand that people in specific states of mind, or during like if it's a period of emotional turbulence, they can do very dangerous things to other
Mm.
people. So while I subscribe to the idea that all humans have a spark of divinity and kindness and sort of like that spirit. I also know that, sometimes that is not in their list of priorities.
It's not
So to say.
expressed down on the earth. I agree
Yes.
with you, and
Yes.
that's a cause of so much pain. But even with the darkest, my exposure to the darkest of humans, and there really have been some horrendous humans I've come across even in the last 5 years. When I'm in my moments of greatest calm and inward looking, I go, just remind yourself, Liz, that they've come from that soul place, that they have that soul within them. They're not connected to it right now, and they will go back to that soul place. And there is a purity, but they're not in touch with it at the moment in this human form. But it's hard when people are wronging you to keep it in that sort of perspective. I mean, I'm not a saint. There are just moments where I have that knowing.
It's so hard.
It's so
It's
hard.
so difficult.
It's so,
I
yeah,
struggle with it so much because I'm also someone who's relatively competitive and ambitious, and I also have sort of an ego. So
yeah.
for me, it's so hard. Only recently have I like taught myself and become able to like not succumb to the temptation of like if someone's like really trashing me or like
Yeah, or doing wrong
to
to you,
yeah,
doing
just to
wrong by
walk
you.
away. Yeah, not
Yeah,
even to like like to turn the other cheek and all of
yeah.
those like sophisticated. Just to have the ability to walk away. You
Yes.
know,
It's not
so
worth
difficult.
it. It's the best way to leave their dark energy with them, actually.
Yes,
It's
yes.
by far the best way, but it's also incredibly painful when there's great wrongdoing and great injustice. But isn't that interesting? People like Jacinda, even, and Ashley Bloomfield, all of these people, these horrible Trudeau, and all of these people from around the world who've betrayed their people and been so cruel in the COVID era, will have still something inside. They may not be aware of it yet, as you say, but eventually there will have to be a connection in the twilight years
Well, I'm sure
with,
right now in the thick of it, they're like I said, they're convinced that they're being a helpful presence. And I know like for people on the outside, it's like so difficult to like I don't know, like if you're a soldier in a war and you're executing like innocent civilians every other day, even that soldier like in the thick of it is like sort of in a sort of like logical sense like thinking like they're doing something, they're committing something virtuous. And to be able to think that way, well, you have to dehumanize your opponent, right? And the more your opponent calls you, oh, you're a monster, you're a fiend, da da da, the more they actually feed your desire to inflict even more torment and pain on them. So I even
yes.
avoid calling people bad people, which is also so difficult. Like I also try to avoid like calling people like, oh, like you're a monster and you're this and this, because what you're doing is you're actually strengthening their ego excuse of like why they're even doing this in the first place. So what I like to do, like if someone's like being rude to me, like, you know what, like I know you're being rude to me, but hopefully, like you can respect their common humanity. I know like you're an honorable man, even though I don't think they're an honorable man at all, right? But I like to remind them of a sort of like a sentiment of honor existing somewhere, in in their vicinity, so they can be like they can at least question, "Am I an honorable man?" Right? Huh? Wait, what?
So let's take an example of that, of Bill Gates, right? It's been declared today, openly declared, after years of calling anyone who said there were chemtrails and they were poisoning us from the skies, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist,
Mhm.
which is, as we said before, a compliment. It means you've got a critical mind. But they're now declaring in the UK, openly declaring that within probably the next 2 weeks, they will start trying to dim dim the sun,
Wow.
and it with
But
chemicals.
why? For what
Well, it's
purpose?
meant to be for climate change. So it was part of this climate change rort. But
Yeah.
at that moment, it is so tempting to write on X, Keir Starmer is utterly evil. He is a monster who is brutalizing his own people. And as for Bill Gates, when will he be locked up? Because he is a criminal. And you're right, all these names. I mean, you ask me to say about Bill Gates, I'm sure, Bill, there's a good side of you. I could not do that right now. I
Well, what
couldn't.
I would say about Bill Gates, and oh my God, like I've commented in the past, and I genuinely like after learning this, and this is like a new discovery for me. Okay, like after switching to this mindset, um, um, what helped me do so is I'm writing a book called The Art of Quiet Living, and the process of writing it like really helped me
Beautiful
like
title.
understand this. Thank
Yeah.
you. So in the past, I even have a few posts on my X and whatever, like me like just going into people and be like, oh, look at this person's physiognomy, that person's physiognomy, and he's like this, and he's like so right now, like I feel like my eyes have finally opened. Where like if you ask me now, like say something about Bill Gates, and I would say that he's such a sort of like an intellectual character, and he's such a persona. I just wish he could redivert some of those gifts he has into, you know, more charitable causes, right? Or something like that. And I would genuinely mean it. Like I wouldn't just say it. Like I would
Right.
genuinely mean it,
Yeah.
right? Because I'm not gonna stoke the fire of his rebellion, right? Or his revenge
Yes.
against the other. And it's so hard. This is so hard. Like I fail this every time. But I feel like if you're on that level of consciousness, and if you genuinely do this, it's like it's going to find root. There's a great, I
Oh,
forget what it was, but it was either like a book I read or something about these two criminals that end up finding a way. So they have a plan to rob a city from its riches, and what they do is they decide, like in order to become like influential people in this city, that they're going to do all these charitable acts, right, with the end goal of, if we do these charitable acts, people will start to love us, they'll vote for us, they'll vote us in, and then we'll steal everything from the bank, right? And they start to do these charitable acts, like as a facade of like, well, we're gonna go where we want to go, right? And they do it, and in the doing of these charitable acts, right, they receive love, and they receive gratitude, and they have children coming up to them, they're hugging their legs and stuff like that. And one of these guys, well, what we can say, they break. They're like, oh my god, like, I don't want to rob the city anymore, right? Like they're like, wow,
yes.
okay. And they become mayor or something. I don't remember where this was from. They become mayor, and they're a wonderful mayor, right? Um,
Yes.
and they get everything they wanted. So that scenario to me works so much better than Eat the Rich, because Eat the Rich
Yeah.
just, you know, yeah,
It's
we've tried that
so,
before.
that's fascinating because I remember, viscerally remember, Ashley Bloomfield, that head of our health department, being surrounded by little children, all wanting, with pictures they'd drawn of him, because he'd been so sold and propagandized to New Zealanders as this savior. And I knew he was a phony, and he was just lapping it all up. And I remember this sense, this heat going through my body, this anger. You are advocating for those children to be jabbed, and some of them will die early, and some of them will get pericarditis and myocarditis, and you're smiling your way through it. You monster, you monster. And look, honestly, I went through such a period of that, such anger towards Jacinda Ardern for betraying my countrymen and women and selling out our future. And the only way I could find peace in the end was to think of the idea that we are, you talk about theatrics, but we are in a theatre really on this earth. And in order for us to develop, I think there's a saying I always loved: in order for a diamond to shine at its brightest, it must be tossed with the roughest of stones. And that applies to a lot of our human lives. We go through these difficulties, but often people find the best of themselves in these difficulties. So I started to try to flip it with Ardern and say, as horrific as I've found what you've done, you have made me find inordinate courage that I didn't know I had, and the willingness to stand up even against all the odds in these waves of bullying and trolls and all of the manufactured nastiness that comes when someone takes on the system. And so I started to try to thank her, but it didn't last very long.
Mm.
But there is still an argument to say we must have these people in the theatre who play the role of the bad guy or the bad woman, because then the good ones who are willing to stand up for to be courageous enough to say, I won't I won't stand by silently while that person does bad things in this play. It develops the courage of that person to speak out. So if it wasn't for the bad one, we wouldn't develop maybe the depths of goodness that we humans develop through our travails.
Absolutely. Well, if you look at it from a perspective of like, let's say, can you guarantee that if you take out your blade, you'll be able to cut the head off the dragon or the hydra? If you can, like, why do we say that two more will, grow out, right?
Yes.
I feel like that's what it means, because even if you do go and let's say we eat the rich, someone will have to replace those people, and the people who will replace them, right, will come after a period where we've literally eaten the rich. So what kind of people will come to power after that? So it's like this vicious cycle, right, that we feed like from the bottom up. um the great quote from Homer, I believe, is the blade itself incites to deeds of violence, right? So the very existence of the weapon and the conflict, it almost like, if there's a gun in the room, the energy is completely different in that room from the very first second. No matter like who's
Yes.
holding it, who's not holding it. So what you want to do is you want to disarm the room, and you want to take the gun out of the equation, right? And by doing so, it's like, yeah, you're sort of like surrendering your means of defending yourself, I guess. And not everyone can do this. Like you're living in this state of fear where you're like, well, like, I either have to go to war against these people, or I have to, remove myself from the situation and have faith and appeal to like the kindness and the goodness they might still hold in their heart. So the dilemma here is, well, how effectively can you do that? And the other dilemma is, how effectively can you remove the head of the dragon or the snake if you needed to? So I feel like, if you want like a guidebook on like how to act in which situation, you need to really think about these two options. So you need to think, either I try to cut off the head of the snake, or I try to appease it or appeal to it, and so on and so forth. If you go halfway in either direction, you're lost, right? And that's just the sad truth of these types of situations, because the people you're contending against, they have more influence, they have less morals, right?
Yes.
And they're willing to go to lengths that you're probably not willing to go to, unless you have nothing left to lose, right? And it's very dangerous. And I've also interacted with people like that, and like, of course, you also want to hold your ground, but at the same time, you have this understanding of like, you know what, like, then if this devolves into like a situation, then I'll have to go all in, and then I'll have to like put everything that I have in danger, like my reputation, my career, my job, my family, my physical, sort of like health. So you have to get really realistic about these things, right? You have to
Yes.
be realistic, and some things are worth, like, honor is more important than like comforts, right?
Yes. Yes.
But you have to pick and choose your battles wisely. I like to think of myself, for example, as someone who will stand for the right thing, but I will stand for the right thing at the right time in the right situation, not because I'm cowardly, but because I understand that if we fail to cut the head of the snake off, right, on first attempt, right, or properly, two more will grow out, and we'll suffer even more for it. So it's a strange, it's a very strange thing, like, especially in the digital age, where people have access to all kinds of like information about you, about this and that, where they can sort of like, um what like, it's so strange, because in the past, like, if someone didn't like you or someone had a problem with you, like, they would like drive to your house and beat you up or something, right? Like, nowadays it's much more subtle. Nowadays you'll get shadow banned, you'll have no more reach. Suddenly
Yes.
your social media won't work anymore. Suddenly, like, like, your stuff will start getting like being hacked into, and like, it's it's such a it's such a brutal and overwhelming thing, because it gives you this feeling that your enemies are everywhere and all capable, and you're just one person against this massive tide of censorship and, like, just destructive, like you have a faceless enemy, right?
Yes, yes.
Your
And
info is out there everywhere, but your enemy is completely faceless.
yes, exactly. And it's the time for the coward. It's the time for the before, as you mentioned Homer, it was always about the most heroic in the story. This is the era of the most cowardly in the story, who can make the most noise and beat the most tins, pots, and bang them the hardest. And basically, the way that often comes out is they sit behind a very cowardly keyboard and they just write nasty things, and they have no reason to say those things because they don't know you and they haven't done their research, and they're just believing other people's gossip, or they're angry about their own lives. So it's a really odd era in which to. I mean, the only hack for that I have, Jack, is just don't read it. And my father had this great saying, this great adage, which is never explain. Your friends don't need it, and your enemies won't believe you anyway. So it's much
Yeah, that's
better
a good one.
to
Yeah, I
have
have a good one.
equanimity.
That's a good one.
What to finish? I think for the next session, I'd like to really dive into the whole wonderful training you've done and looking at the facial structure. But just to have a little taster of that, what did you ever see in Jacinda Ardern's face when you looked at hers?
Oh, I never actually have looked at her. Let me Google her.
Yeah,
She has a Jacinda Ardern.
Ardern.
Yeah, I have trouble pronouncing that name for sure.
Yeah, I do too, but for different reasons.
Mm. You seem to have like the vendetta, right? She's like
I
your arch
did for a
nemesis.
long time. No, I just could not believe that a woman
do
would
you do you
betray
do
her
you do you
people
know
like
her
that.
personally, or is it sort
No,
of like
thank God. No, I don't. But I do
Hmm.
think that her father had something, may well have had something to do with the physical assault on me at the Auckland airport. And that's a longer
Oh,
story. I'd got some people, he's an ex-cop, but I'd got some people off an island, and he was the administrator of the island. And they'd been
let's see.
locked down in the middle of the Pacific for 14 months with no habeas corpus, all because they wouldn't take the jab that he sanctioned being rolled out to all the people on this little island. It's so remote. This atoll is so remote. It's called Tokelau. It's 20 hours even to get to a fairly remote island called Samoa. So it was way out in the Pacific, and I believe it was the first nation that was to be subject to full eugenics. They were just going to wipe everybody out and
Hmm.
nobody would notice. And one family in the middle of the Pacific, one leader said, "Don't let them do this to us. Our elders would not have sanctioned this." And they refused to take the jab, and they were locked down. And
Hmm.
anyway, after a long time, I got them off the island and was waiting to greet them at the airport. And I got horrifically assaulted. So I've always wondered if her
Hmm.
father wasn't behind that through his police connections, but I've never met her. But no, not a vendetta. Well, for a while, a vendetta, because I was so furious that one woman would so lie and be devious and betray and know that her people were being hurt and have no compassion. It was too much for my mind to bear. So the way I dealt with it was through anger. And then I've realized she had the role to play of being this baddie in the movie. That was her role.
Well, it's very difficult to say that, and I don't think I would be able to say it. Like I don't want to come off as like, oh, I'm like preaching this, but I fail to practice this all the time,
Yeah.
especially like live as these things are like happening and unfolding. Because like when you're in danger, life's in danger, you're sort of like being attacked, so on and so forth. It's really difficult to look at them and be like, well, I guess this is how it's supposed to be, right? Like, and
Yeah.
I don't know if I fully even believe that, right? I believe in human free will within the context of divine destiny. So there are still
Yes.
choices and choices being made. About this particular lady, if you'd like, on our next conversation, we could do like a full face reading of her and see what we find. She
I
does
would
have
love
interesting
that.
physiognomy. Yeah, she
Yeah.
does have interesting physiognomy, and we can do like and maybe if viewers are also interested in this sort of thing, they'll sort of like see what the process is like what we look for, what we uncover, what kind of assumptions we can make, stuff like that. So we could definitely do that. It's sort of like a longer process.
Yes.
There's like an intuitive element to it. There's a formulaic element to it. I wouldn't necessarily say it leans towards, how to say, it's somewhere between a dignified practice and a shady practice. It's somewhere in the middle. So that's also an interesting element. So we can definitely do it. Um, but hey,
Uh,
let me ask you this, Liz. Are you okay with? And this is just like a random favor. Would you be fine with releasing these two first interviews that we have now first, and then the next two after to create some sort of like hype for this face reading session thing?
I
Are
would
you okay with it?
love that. I would absolutely love that. Yeah, we'll put up these two, and then perhaps I'll talk to you again on Monday if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, what is the mask that is your image on the
It,
screen that
it's
I'm looking
it's
at?
it's a $2 mask that I bought in the supermarket. You know,
I thought it
I'm
must be.
cheap.
I thought it must be from some classical museum or it. I was really curious.
Well, it's I actually have a friend who is an incredibly talented mask maker. Like
Yeah.
his life's work is creating these elaborate masks. And he keeps telling me, "Hey, man, you're all about faces, this physiognomy. Like, let me make you a mask." And I just tell him that I don't need it. Right? It's not like I'm gonna. It's literally I did this interview with a friend of mine who wanted me on camera, and I was like, okay, then I'll have to wear a mask. And they're like, okay, great, no problem. Do you have a mask? And I said, well, no, I don't. I'll just go and buy one right now.
That's
So
good.
it was funny because it was Halloween time. Like when I did, so I went to the first supermarket and I was, hey, do you have a mask? The simpler the better. They gave me a $2 mask, and now the $2 mask is my profile picture
It's
everywhere.
brilliant because the lighting is good, and I was thinking, has he been to Venice for that masked ball they have? It's a little, it's enigmatic. Like why do you like to keep your image off screen, Jack?
Like initially, because I wanted, like, I understand like the energy like people exude, right? So
Yes,
sometimes I have a physiognomy that's, like a lot of people tell me that like I come off as a little bit standoffish, and like people are a little bit intimidated by me sometimes, and that's just because of like how my physiognomy is. Like, I don't have any like deformities or anything like that on my face. I'm just like, I would say like an average looking person with his own I don't know, like attractive parts and unattractive parts or whatever. But I feel like I am someone who is meant to work from behind the scenes. I'm not like, let's say,
yes,
someone like yourself who has a very welcoming aura and like welcoming energy, and your physiognomy is like very homey and hearty, and like the way you come off is not how I come off, right? I come off as a little bit pretentious, right? So I prefer if people just saw like like the words behind
yes,
the man, right? But I don't like, I'm not like hiding my identity or anything like that. A lot of people, like, they've met me in real life. I've met a lot of people from X, and they've met me in real life, and we had a great time, we had a blast. So I'm not like hiding in like this mystical sense or like this
yes,
conspiratorial sense. But I would rather if the presentation was this, and the important thing is what's being discussed, and the
yes.
person behind it is is just some normie, average person from a distant like mountain village that no one really cares about.
I love
Like,
it. I love it because as a child I loved the radio, and I loved radio stories because my brain made all of the images from the voices. And for me, not standoffish at all. Your voice has a beautiful warmth to it and a timbre, but it just
thank
allows
you.
my brain to create the image. I like the enigma of it. And I love our discussions. I'm really enjoying this. So we'll get these two out and I'll talk to you again on Monday.
Yeah, please do. Let's make some hype out of it. And
Definitely. I'm so
it'll be fun. Let's
curious.
have some fun with
I might have
it.
a few other faces to do. It'll be interesting to hear what you have to say about Jacinda Ardern. That will be fun.
Okay,
Okay.
let's do that on
Thank
Monday
you.
then. Let's do that on
Okay.
Monday. It's
Lovely.
been a pleasure, as
Thank
always.
you, Jack. I love it.
Thank you, Liz.